he signed the papers to dissolve her mother's company. On the same morning, he asked Serena to move into their house. He used a pen she had given him for their 4th anniversary. He did not tell her what he had signed. Cecilia Hartwell was 41 years old when she discovered that the man she had built a life with was systematically dismantling the one her mother had spent 30 years constructing. She discovered it not through confrontation, not through some dramatic revelation, but through a number on a bank statement that was $17,000 smaller than it should have been. That was how it started. A number. The kind of discrepancy that a different woman might have attributed to error, to oversight, to the ordinary messiness of shared finances. Cecilia did not attribute things to error. Her mother had raised her not to. Her name was Harriet Hartwell, and she had built Hartwell Textiles from a single industrial loom in a rented warehouse in Raleigh, North Carolina, into a regional manufacturing company with 47 employees, 3 production facilities, and a client roster that included department store chains up and down the eastern seaboard. She had done this while raising Cecilia alone after Cecilia's father left when Cecilia was 6, and she had done it without ever once describing herself as remarkable. She described herself as someone who paid attention. She had been teaching Cecilia to pay attention since before Cecilia could read. She taught her to read contracts before she signed them. She taught her to watch how people behaved in the 5 minutes after they thought the meeting was over. She taught her that the loudest person in the room was usually the least informed, and that the most dangerous assumption a woman could make was that someone else was watching out for her interests. "You watch out for your own," Harriet used to say. "And you do it quietly, because the moment you announce that you're watching, they start performing instead of revealing." Cecilia had carried that instruction into her marriage. She had carried it into the 11 years she spent a corporate attorney at a firm in Charlotte, a man who moved through the world with the particular confidence of someone who had never been told that his confidence was not the same thing as competence. He was charming in the way that required maintenance, the practiced laugh, the well-timed compliment, the ability to make every person in a room feel briefly like the most important person in it. Cecilia had recognized the mechanism early. She had watched it operate on her before she understood what it was. And, by the time she understood it, she had already said yes to the ring he offered her across a dinner table at a restaurant he had chosen. Because it was the kind of place where people took photographs and posted them. She had loved him. Or something she mistook for love in the years before she learned to distinguish between genuine warmth and warmth deployed for strategic effect. What she knew now, standing in the kitchen at 6:30 in the morning with a bank statement in her hand and a cold cup of coffee on the counter, was that whatever she had felt, Brandon had never loved her. He had loved what she represented, and what she represented, though he did not know the full dimensions of it, was access. Hartwell Textiles had been placed in a family trust when Harriet's health began to decline 2 years into Cecilia and Brandon's marriage. The trust was structured by Harriet's attorney, a woman named Frances Okafor, who specialized in business succession planning, and who had advised Harriet with the kind of frank precision that Harriet had spent 30 years looking for in a lawyer, and not finding until Frances walked into her office, carrying a briefcase that had seen serious use, and an expression that said she had no patience for people who were not serious themselves. The trust was clean, carefully built, and Cecilia was its sole beneficiary. Brandon was not mentioned in it. His name did not appear in any document associated with Hartwell Textiles or the Hartwell family holdings. Harriet had made sure of that before the ink was dry on the marriage certificate. What Harriet had not been able to prevent was Brandon's appointment, 8 months ago, to the role of financial advisor to the Marsh Hartwell household accounts, a role that Cecilia had offered him in a moment of good faith, and that Brandon had accepted with an enthusiasm she had not, at the time, found suspicious. She had been managing her mother's medical care. She had been driving 2 hours each direction 3 times a week to sit with Harriet through chemotherapy. She had been managing the emotional weight of watching her mother, the most capable person she had ever known, struggle to lift a coffee cup. She had not had the bandwidth to watch Brandon the way she normally watched people, and Brandon had known that. She understood that now with the cold clarity of hindsight. He had waited for the window and stepped through it. The $17,000 was not a bank error. She knew that before she finished her second cup of coffee. It was a transfer to a joint brokerage account that Brandon had opened without telling her, under a name that combined both their surnames, in a configuration she had never agreed to, and would not have agreed to if asked. She found 2 more transfers when she looked further back, 42,000 over 4 months, moved in increments small enough not to trigger automatic alerts, large enough to matter. She sat at the kitchen table and looked at the numbers, and felt something her mother had once described to her after a business partner tried to cut her out of a deal she had originated. Not anger, exactly. More like the sensation of the room rearranging itself around you. When you finally see what was always there. She did not call Brandon, who was at the office. She did not text. She opened her laptop and began to document. She had learned documentation from Harriet, who kept records the way some people kept diaries, with the discipline of someone who understood that memory was unreliable and paper was not. Cecilia's documentation over the following 3 weeks was the product of this inheritance. Bank records, email threads, the lease agreement on an apartment in uptown Charlotte that Brandon was paying for with money from an account she hadn't known existed. Receipts from a furniture store, a duplicate key that she found in his gym bag. Not a key to their house, a key to a different lock, and finally, a text thread on his phone that she saw one evening when he left it unlocked on the bathroom counter, a thread with a contact named simply L that made the furniture store receipts, and the apartment lease, and the duplicate key, all snap into a pattern she could have drawn with her eyes closed. Her name was Lindsay, 27. She worked in marketing at a financial services company 3 blocks from Brandon's office. Cecilia found her LinkedIn profile in 11 minutes. She was blonde and confident in the way of someone who had not yet learned that confidence and judgment were different things. And she was pregnant 6 months along, which Cecilia learned from an Instagram account set to public that Lindsay had apparently not thought to make private, perhaps because she did not know that the wife she was helping to deceive was someone who paid attention to everything. Cecilia sat in her car in the parking structure under her office building and held her phone and looked at the photograph. A maternity shoot at a botanical garden, Lindsay in a cream-colored dress, her hands on her stomach, the caption reading something about new chapters. Posted 17 days ago. Brandon had liked it. She thought about her mother, who was in a hospital bed in a room that Cecilia had arranged with the same methodical attention. She applied to everything, the photographs on the windowsill, the specific pillow from home, the audiobooks loaded onto the tablet, because Harriet couldn't hold a physical book anymore and would not admit how much that frustrated her. She thought about the 30 years Harriet had spent building something real, and the 2 years Brandon had been quietly testing the edges of it, looking for the seam where it might open. She thought about the duplicate key and the apartment and the $42,000 and the photograph of a woman in a cream dress at a botanical garden. And she felt the last remaining warmth she had been carrying for Brandon Marsh go out inside her, like a light switched off in an empty room. She called her mother that evening. Harriet picked up on the second ring. "I know," Harriet said, before Cecilia had finished the opening sentence. "How long?" "Frances flagged something 8 weeks ago. I asked her to watch and document before we said anything to you." Cecilia was quiet. "You were managing enough," Harriet said. Her voice was tired but precise. The voice of a woman operating at reduced capacity, who had not reduced her standards to match. "I was not going to add this while you were sitting with me through treatments. You would have gone straight at him and that would have given him time to cover. What do I do? Nothing yet. You let Frances finish what she's building. And you let him continue to believe that you don't see it. He's been moving money. I know. Frances has it documented. Every transfer, every account, every dollar." She paused. "He also had a conversation with an attorney last month, a divorce attorney." Cecilia's hand tightened on the phone. "He's been inquiring about Hartwell Textiles," Harriet continued. "What he might be entitled to in a divorce settlement. His attorney apparently believes there are grounds to claim partial marital interest in the trust assets. He can't. He cannot. Frances has been very clear on this. The trust is airtight and its establishment predates any financial contribution he has ever made to this household. But he doesn't know that. He believes he has a claim. And a man who believes he has a claim will keep pushing until someone shows him the boundary." "How do we show him the boundary?" Harriet was quiet for 4 seconds. The kind of quiet that Cecilia had learned over 41 years contained the weight of a conclusion already reached and being handed across carefully. "You let him show you exactly how far he's willing to go. And then Frances shows him where the floor is." Cecilia looked out the window at the street below. A woman was walking a dog. Traffic moved past in the ordinary way of a city that did not know it was backdrop for anything. What if the time doesn't come naturally? It will come, Harriet said. Men like Brandon always accelerate. They cannot help it. They believe they are the smartest person managing any situation they are in, and that belief makes them reckless. He will move more money. He will make a formal inquiry. He will do something that puts the intent beyond any reasonable interpretation. And when he does, Frances will be ready. Cecilia sat with that. She sat with the weight of it, the specific exhaustion of a woman who has been managing someone else's comfort for years and has just been asked to manage it for a little while longer before she is permitted to stop. She went inside. She made dinner. She asked Brandon about his day when he came home and listened to the answer, and smiled at the moments that required smiling. And she said nothing about the bank records, or the apartment key, or the photograph at the botanical garden, or the conversation she'd had with her mother that had set something in motion that Brandon Marsh was not equipped to understand. Harriet Hartwell died on a Thursday morning in March. The hospice nurse was there. Cecilia was there. She had been there for the preceding 48 hours, sleeping in the chair beside the bed, waking every hour, holding her mother's hand across the space between the chair and the mattress. She watched the monitors and she breathed, and she felt the particular grief of losing the person who had taught you how to be a person. The grief that has no floor, because the ground you were standing on was them. She stood afterward in the hallway of the hospice center, and she looked at the door to her mother's room, and she thought about all the things Harriet had spent the last 2 years doing while dying. The trust, the documentation, the calls with Frances, the careful architecture of protection built in the margins of a terminal illness. She touched the silver watch on her wrist, her mother's watch, plain-faced, practical, the kind of watch that did not announce itself, that simply kept time with precision, because that was what it was for. Then she straightened. She walked to the family waiting room where Frances Okafor was sitting with a briefcase and an expression of professional readiness that Cecilia recognized because she had seen it on her mother's face across 30 years of business meetings. The kind of face that said the work was not finished. "It is done," Cecilia said. "I know." Frances stood. "Everything your mother built is in place. He cannot touch it. He doesn't know that yet." "No, he doesn't." Cecilia looked back toward the room. She felt the bracelet on her wrist, the watch face cool under her fingers, the second hand still moving. "Then let him come to the estate meeting," she said. "Let him sit at that table and tell us what he thinks he's entitled to. Let him show us the full extent of what he believes." Frances had been practicing succession law for 19 years. She had sat with families in grief more times than she could count. She had watched loss take 100 different shapes. She had never seen it take the shape of this. The absolute stillness of a woman who had learned patience from someone who had just demonstrated its final, most powerful application. And then Cecilia said, turning to face her, "We show him exactly what my mother spent the last 2 years building while he was taking." The estate meeting was held on a Monday 6 weeks after the funeral, in the conference room of the Raleigh office of Okafor and Associates. It was a room that Frances had chosen deliberately. The building was not imposing. The furniture was not designed to intimidate. The coffee on the table was in a plain carafe, and the chairs were the kind that did not announce their cost. Frances believed that the room, where someone learned the true shape of their circumstances, should not look like a stage. It should look like a place where ordinary things happened, because what was about to happen was not a performance. It was a reckoning. Brandon arrived with his attorney, a man named Paul Delaney, who specialized in high-asset divorce litigation, and who had spent the past 6 weeks building a case premised on the assumption that Harriet Hartwell's estate was a windfall that had arrived, in his client's view, at a fortunate moment. Paul Delaney had reviewed what Brandon had told him about the financials. He had not yet reviewed what Frances Okafor was carrying in her briefcase. He would spend the rest of the week trying to recover from that gap. Brandon came in wearing a suit he wore to important meetings, charcoal, well cut, the tie selected to suggest seriousness without effort. He sat down across from the empty chairs, where Cecilia and Frances would sit, and he arranged his expression into something resembling sympathetic gravity, the look of a man who understood the weight of the moment, and was prepared to be reasonable about it. He was not prepared to be reasonable. He was prepared to take. He had simply learned, over years of watching Cecilia absorb difficulty without complaint, that the performance of reasonableness was the most effective mechanism for getting what he wanted from her. He had miscalculated the room. Cecilia entered at 9. She wore a gray blazer. Her hair was pulled back. She was not wearing the silver watch. She had left it at home, deliberately, because it was not for this room. The things her mother had given her that mattered were not on her body today. They were in the briefcase that Francis set on the table beside her. She sat down across from Brandon. She looked at him directly. Then she looked away and waited. Paul Delaney opened with the position he had prepared. His client sought equitable division of marital assets accumulated over 11 years of marriage, including the primary residence, joint investment holdings, and any inheritance or business interest received by Cecilia Hartwell during marriage from the estate of Harry Hartwell, including but not limited to the assets of Hartwell Textiles and associated holding structures. He said it with the practiced fluency of a man who believed the ground under him was solid. Frances let him finish. She did not write anything. She did not shift in her chair. When Paul finished, she opened her briefcase and placed a single folder on the table, with the efficiency of someone who had made this gesture before and understood its weight. Several factual clarifications before we discuss division. The primary residence at 4 Meridian Court, Charlotte. Mr. Marsh believes this property is jointly owned. It is not. The property is titled to the Hartwell Family Trust, established in 2007, 3 years before the marriage. Mr. Marsh's name does not appear on the deed, the mortgage, or any document associated with the property. He has been, by legal definition, a resident in trust-held property for the duration of the marriage. Paul's pen did not stop moving. He was still making notes with the momentum of a man who had not yet understood what was being said. The joint household accounts. Mr. Marsh transferred a total of $61,400 from these accounts into a personal brokerage he opened without Mrs. Marsh's knowledge or consent. These transfers occurred across a 4-month period and were structured in increments designed to avoid automatic reporting thresholds. Francis placed a second document on the table. The transfers are fully documented, time-stamped it, and were initiated after Mr. Marsh had already consulted with divorce counsel, establishing clear premeditation. Under North Carolina law, this constitutes dissipation of marital assets and exposes Mr. Marsh to significant liability. Paul's pen stopped. Additionally, the life insurance policy originally naming both spouses as co-beneficiaries was modified by Mr. Marsh in January of this year to name himself as sole beneficiary without disclosure to or consent from his spouse. We have the original filing and the modification. Brandon's jaw had tightened. His expression had not yet broken, but the edges of it were moving. The way ice moves before it fractures. Subtle, structural, irreversible. Regarding Hartwell Textiles and the associated trust holdings, Frances looked at Brandon for the first time since she had begun speaking. Her gaze was even and without hostility. It was simply the gaze of a person who was about to correct a significant error, and was doing so without pleasure, but also without hesitation. Mr. Marsh appears to believe that the Hartwell estate constitutes marital property subject to equitable distribution. I need to address that assumption directly. She placed the third document on the table. The Hartwell Family Trust was established in 2007. Its primary assets include Hartwell Textiles, its 3 production facilities, and a portfolio of associated commercial properties with a current combined valuation of approximately $218 million. Every asset in this trust predates the marriage. None have been commingled with marital funds at any point. Under North Carolina law, inherited and trust-held property is not subject to equitable distribution in divorce proceedings. Mr. Marsh has no claim to any portion of the Hartwell estate. The silence in the room was complete. Paul Delaney was no longer taking notes. He was looking at the document in front of him with the expression of a man, recalculating every conversation he'd had with his client over the preceding 6 weeks, and arriving at conclusions that were not going to be comfortable to convey. Brandon stared at Cecilia. His face moved through its stages. The confidence first, the assumption that he was still in a negotiation he could win, then the arithmetic, the gap between what he had believed and what he had just heard, closing in on him with the speed of something that had always been true and had simply been waiting to be stated. Then, something beneath that, something that looked less like anger and more like the particular shock of a man who has just realized that the quiet, accommodating woman across the table from him was never what he had decided she was. 200 million. His voice came out wrong, too low. The voice of a man who had intended to project certainty and found nothing behind it. Your mother's company is worth. 218, Francis said, not including liquid holdings. Brandon's hands were flat on the table. He looked at Cecilia. He looked at her the way he had never looked at her during 11 years of marriage. Which is to say, he looked at her as though she were actually there. You knew, he said. The whole time. Cecilia met his eyes. She held them for 3 seconds, without speaking. Which was, she had learned from her mother, the most effective possible response to a question that did not deserve the dignity of speed. I knew everything, Brandon. She kept her voice even, the same voice she had used at 6 in the morning, making coffee, and at 11 at night, waiting for him to come home from wherever he had actually been. I knew about Lindsay. I knew about the apartment on Tryon Street. I knew about the brokerage account you opened in February, and the insurance policy you changed in January, and the consultation you had with Paul in September. I knew about all of it. Every transfer. Every evening, you said you were working late. Every time you sat at our kitchen table and told me about your day while I sat across from you and asked questions and listened and said nothing about any of the things I already knew. She paused. She thought of her mother in the last weeks, too tired to sit up but still asking Francis about the trust structure, still signing documents with a hand that shook, still insisting on finishing what she had started. My mother knew before I did. She spent the last year of her life, while she was dying, making certain that when you showed me exactly who you were, there would be nothing left for you to take. The watch, she said. I left it at home, because this room is not the place for the things she gave me that matter. This room is the place for the record she kept of everything you did. And she kept a very thorough record. She stood. She picked up her jacket from the back of the chair. She did not button it. She looked down at Brandon Marsh, the man who had sat across from her at dinner tables and accepted birthday gifts she chose and wrapped and said, "Thank you to both their names for." And she felt the extraordinary lightness of a woman who has just set down something extremely heavy and will not be picking it up again. The house will be rekeyed by Thursday, she said. Francis will coordinate the logistics of your removal. The accounts are frozen pending the dissipation claim. Anything you left in the house that you want back, provide a list to Francis's office by Friday. She walked to the door. She opened it. She paused. You spent 11 years living in a house that was never yours, she said, supported by money that was never yours, in a life that existed because of work you never once asked about. You thought that was ordinary. She looked at him one last time, clearly, without ceremony. It wasn't. It was a gift. And you used it to buy furniture for someone else's apartment. The door closed. The unraveling took approximately 4 months, and it was without drama, in the way that only truly comprehensive collapses can be without drama, too total to perform, too inevitable to narrate with any real suspense. The house was rekeyed on Thursday as promised. Brandon's boxes arrived at his mother's house in Concord, 7 hours from Charlotte. Because Lindsay had, after a quiet conversation that he would describe to no one in any detail, determined that she needed to focus on herself and her pregnancy, and that the situation was more complicated than she had originally understood. His firm conducted a compliance review triggered by the disclosed dissipation claim and placed him on administrative leave within 3 weeks. His access to the joint accounts was restricted by court order. His credit cards, which he had been using as though the infrastructure of his former life was still intact, declined. He had nothing to do with the fact that Hartwell Textiles was now fully under Cecilia's direction. He had no relationship to the decisions she made in the months that followed. The expansion into sustainable fabrics that Harriet had been planning before her diagnosis, the workforce development program. She funded in partnership with 2 community colleges in Raleigh the renovation of the Hartwell warehouse in Durham into a training facility for women re-entering the workforce. He had no connection to any of it. He was simply a man in a wrinkled suit, taking conference calls from a spare bedroom in his mother's house. The invisible infrastructure of his life removed, and the extent of that invisibility finally, comprehensively clear. A year after the divorce was finalized, the Charlotte Business Journal ran a profile of Cecilia Hartwell under the headline, "The Quiet Architect of Hartwell's Next Chapter." The article discussed the expansion, the workforce programs, the sustainable manufacturing pivot, the specific methodical intelligence that had driven each decision. It quoted Francis Okafor briefly. It quoted 2 of Hartwell's 47 employees at length. It mentioned Brandon Marsh once, in a single clause, as her former spouse, and moved on. The photograph they used showed Cecilia on the production floor of the Raleigh facility. standing beside a loom that had been running since 1994, the year her mother installed it. She was not posed. She had not been told the photographer was going to take that particular shot. She was looking at the loom with an expression the journalist described in the article as someone doing the math of something large and finding the numbers correct. Her hands were in her jacket pockets. There was no jewelry visible except a plain silver watch on her left wrist. Brandon saw the article. He saw it the way people see things in the age of the internet. Without warning, the image loading on his phone while he was waiting for a job interview at a consultancy firm whose name he would not have recognized 3 years earlier. He looked at the photograph for a long time. He thought about the woman in the picture and the woman who had sat across from him in the kitchen every morning making coffee. And he tried to locate the difference between them and could not. Because there was no difference. They had always been the same woman. He had simply chosen not to look. He put his phone in his pocket. He went into the interview. He answered the questions they asked him with the practiced fluency of a man who had learned to perform competence, and he got the job. And he went home to his apartment in Concord. Smaller, now. The 12 boxes of belongings from Charlotte. Unpacked into a space that was adequate and nothing more. And he sat in the evening quiet of a life stripped of everything that had not actually belonged to him, and understood, for the first time, and too late, the specific quality of what he had thrown away. Not the money, not the house, not the access to a fortune he had never deserved and could not have kept. What he had thrown away was simpler and more costly than any of that. He had thrown away a woman who had paid his bills and managed his calendar and remembered his mother's birthday and asked about his day every single evening for 11 years, and who had done all of it, every ordinary daily act of care, while being something he had never once bothered to understand. He had mistaken the care for availability. He had mistaken the competence for service. He had mistaken the silence for nothing, when the silence had been, the whole time, the sound of someone thinking at a frequency he was not equipped to hear. On a Sunday in September, 13 months after the divorce, Cecilia sat on the porch of a house in the Outer Banks that had been in the Hartwell family since before she was born. The water was visible from the porch, through a break in the dunes. The morning was cool. She held a cup of coffee in both hands, and she watched the light change over the water, with the patience of someone who had no appointment, no schedule, no performance to maintain. Her phone was on the table beside her. On it was the encrypted folder she had built over 4 weeks, the bank records and receipts and screenshots. The documentary record of Brandon's decisions assembled with the care that her mother had taught her was not paranoia, but preparation. She opened it. She read through it once, slowly, the way you read something you have memorized, not to retrieve information but to mark its completion. Then she closed it. She selected it. She deleted it. She put the phone face down on the table. She looked at the water. She thought about her mother, who had spent 30 years building something real, in a world that frequently overlooked real things in favor of loud ones, who had spent the last year of her life dying, while simultaneously constructing a legal structure that no one without her discipline and foresight could have built, who had sat in a hospital bed too tired to hold a book, and still asked Frances about the trust documents, because she was not finished yet, because there was one more thing she needed to do for her daughter before she left. Cecilia touched the watch on her wrist, the plain face, the second hand still moving. The coffee was good. The water was doing what water does, indifferent and endless and entirely unbothered by the events of any individual life happening in view of it. She sat with that, with the specific piece of a woman, and returned to the size she was always meant to be. She had not been waiting to be seen. She had never needed to be seen. What she had needed was to stop arranging herself around a person who was never going to look, and she had done that now, and the relief of it was not loud. It was not a triumph that announced itself. It was the ordinary, sufficient feeling of a room returning to its right temperature after a window has been left open too long and someone has finally, simply closed it.